The Pacific War of 1941 to 1945 produced some of the most brutal combat conditions in modern military history. Across thousands of miles of ocean, jungle, and island terrain, American and Japanese forces clashed in a conflict that would ultimately reshape the global order. Yet beyond the headlines of major battles and strategic victories lies a lesser-known narrative that reveals profound cultural differences and human experiences. This is the story of Japanese prisoners of war who, upon capture by American forces, encountered something that shocked them more deeply than captivity itself: modern hygiene standards that seemed almost incomprehensible compared to what they had known in the Imperial Japanese Army. When the first Japanese soldiers began surrendering to American forces in significant numbers during the middle years of the war, they carried with them expectations shaped by their own military culture and propaganda. The Imperial Japanese Army had instilled in its troops a warrior code known as Bushido, which emphasized honor, loyalty, and the belief that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers were taught that death in battle was preferable to the shame of becoming a prisoner. This indoctrination was so thorough that many Japanese troops chose suicide over capture, whether through direct combat, grenade suicide, or jumping from cliffs. The propaganda apparatus of Imperial Japan painted a horrifying picture of what awaited those who fell into enemy hands: torture, execution, humiliation, and barbaric treatment that would dishonor not only the soldier but his entire family back home. These expectations made the reality of American POW camps all the more stunning. When Japanese prisoners arrived at facilities like those in Hawaii, California, and other mainland locations, they prepared themselves mentally for the worst. Instead, they encountered something entirely different. Processing began immediately upon arrival, and one of the first experiences that left Japanese POWs bewildered was the mandatory medical examination. American military doctors examined each prisoner thoroughly, checking for wounds, diseases, malnutrition, and parasites. This alone was extraordinary to men who had rarely, if ever, received proper medical attention during their service in the Imperial Army. Many arrived suffering from tropical diseases, infected wounds, malnutrition, and infestations of lice and other parasites that had gone untreated for months or even years. Following the medical examination came something even more remarkable: the showers. American POW facilities were equipped with modern plumbing systems that provided hot and cold running water on demand. For Japanese soldiers who had spent months or years in the field with minimal access to clean water, the concept of a hot shower was almost magical. Many had gone weeks or months without properly bathing, relying instead on occasional dips in rivers, streams, or the ocean when circumstances permitted. The harsh realities of jungle warfare meant that personal hygiene was often the last priority, sacrificed in favor of survival, combat readiness, and following orders. Water had to be carefully rationed for drinking, and the idea of using precious water resources for bathing was often considered a luxury that could not be afforded.
The shower facilities themselves were unlike anything most Japanese POWs had experienced. Rows of shower heads with adjustable temperature controls, tiled floors with proper drainage, and a seemingly unlimited supply of hot water created an environment that felt almost decadent. American guards would demonstrate how to use the fixtures, showing prisoners how to adjust the water temperature and use the various facilities. Many Japanese soldiers stood in wonder as hot water cascaded over their bodies, perhaps for the first time in their lives. The temperature could be controlled with a simple turn of a handle, providing warmth that penetrated muscles aching from combat and captivity. For men who had endured tropical heat, monsoon rains, and the constant discomfort of field conditions, This simple act of bathing became a transformative experience. Accompanying the showers was an abundance of soap. Real soap, not the crude substitutes they might have occasionally accessed in the Imperial Army. American facilities provided bars of soap made from quality ingredients, designed to clean effectively and even produce a pleasant lather and scent. This, too, was remarkable to Japanese POWs. In the Imperial Japanese Army, soap was often in short supply or entirely unavailable to common soldiers. Personal hygiene products were considered non-essential luxuries that diverted resources from the war effort. Soldiers made do with whatever they could find, sometimes using sand, ash, or rough cloth to scrub their skin, or simply going without any cleaning agents at all. The concept that every prisoner would receive their own bar of soap, regularly replaced when depleted, seemed almost wasteful by the standards they had known. Clean towels presented another striking contrast. After showering, each POW was provided with a clean, dry towel, often still warm from recent laundering. The American military logistics system ensured that laundry facilities operated continuously, washing and drying linens and clothing in industrial quantities. Towels were rotated regularly, collected after use, washed and redistributed. This system, mundane by American standards, represented an organizational achievement and resource commitment that Japanese prisoners found astounding. In their own military experience, personal items like towels were often non-existent. Soldiers dried themselves in the sun, used their uniforms, or simply allowed the tropical heat to evaporate moisture from their skin. The idea that an enemy nation would expend resources and effort to ensure that prisoners had clean, dry towels after bathing challenged their understanding of military priorities and resource allocation. The hygiene standards extended far beyond the shower facilities. American POW camps maintained strict sanitation protocols designed to prevent disease and maintain health. Barracks were regularly inspected and cleaned. Bedding was provided and laundered on a schedule. Toilets and latrines were modern flush systems or well-maintained outdoor facilities that were regularly cleaned and disinfected. Waste disposal followed organized procedures designed to prevent contamination of water supplies and living areas. These measures, standard practice in American military doctrine, represented a level of attention to sanitation that seemed extraordinary to men who had lived in conditions where dysentery, cholera, and other sanitation-related diseases were constant threats.
Dental hygiene represented yet another revelation. American facilities provided toothbrushes and toothpaste to POWs, along with instruction on proper dental care. Regular dental examinations were conducted, and necessary dental work was performed by military dentists. For many Japanese soldiers, this was their first encounter with professional dental care. Toothbrushes were rare luxuries in the Imperial Army, and dental problems were typically endured until they became severe enough to affect combat readiness. Tooth decay, gum disease, and dental abscesses were common ailments that went untreated. The American practice of preventative dental care, treating problems before they became severe, was a completely foreign concept to most Japanese POWs. The contrast became even more stark when prisoners shared their experiences of hygiene conditions within the Imperial Japanese Army. Life as a soldier in Japan's military was characterized by harsh discipline, minimal resources, and a philosophy that embraced suffering as character building. Personal comfort was not merely de-emphasized, it was actively discouraged as a sign of weakness. Soldiers were expected to endure hardship without complaint, to subsist on minimal rations, and to maintain combat effectiveness despite living in conditions that Western militaries would consider inhumane. Water for washing was scarce, available only when operational circumstances permitted. In many combat zones, particularly in the jungles of New Guinea, Burma, and the Solomon Islands, clean water sources were rare and often contested territory. Bathing, when it occurred at all, typically involved quick immersion in whatever water source was available: rivers, streams, or collected rainwater. These water sources were often shared with animals, contaminated with waste, or located in areas vulnerable to enemy attack. There was no privacy, no temperature control, and certainly no soap or towels. Soldiers washed their uniforms in the same water, if they washed them at all. Many simply wore the same clothing continuously until it rotted off their bodies, replaced when new supplies could be obtained. Skin diseases, fungal infections, and parasitic infestations were endemic. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were so common that they were accepted as an unavoidable part of military life. Medical care in the Imperial Japanese Army was rudimentary at best and often entirely absent. Field hospitals were undersupplied and overwhelmed. Medical personnel were insufficient in number and lacked essential supplies. Wounded soldiers were sometimes simply left behind when units moved, as the Army lacked the resources or logistical capability to evacuate and treat large numbers of casualties. Diseases that were preventable or easily treatable with proper sanitation and medical care, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, tropical ulcers, claimed more Japanese soldiers than enemy action in many campaigns. Yet the military culture discouraged complaints about illness or injury. Soldiers were expected to continue fighting until they literally could not stand, and seeking medical treatment was often viewed as a weakness or dereliction of duty.
The hygiene situation was exacerbated by the logistical challenges Japan faced as the war progressed. As American submarines decimated Japanese merchant shipping and Allied forces pushed closer to the home islands, supply lines were cut and resources became increasingly scarce. Troops stationed on isolated Pacific islands were effectively abandoned, receiving no resupply and forced to survive on whatever they could forage or grow. Under these circumstances, items like soap, medicine, or clean clothing were impossible luxuries. Soldiers fashioned crude shelters from jungle materials, hunted for food, and succumbed in large numbers to starvation and disease. The disparity between these conditions and what they encountered as POWs in American hands was almost incomprehensible. Beyond the physical aspects of hygiene, there was a psychological dimension to the POWs' astonishment. The American commitment to maintaining high sanitation standards for prisoners reflected cultural values that were foreign to the Japanese military experience. In Western military tradition, particularly as practiced by the United States, there was a recognition that healthy prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to spread disease, and more likely to cooperate with camp authorities. There was also a humanitarian impulse rooted in international agreements like the Geneva Conventions, which outlined minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. While American treatment of Japanese POWs was not without its problems and controversies, it generally adhered to these principles far more closely than Japan's treatment of Allied prisoners. This adherence to international humanitarian standards was itself puzzling to many Japanese POWs. They came from a military culture that viewed such concerns as weakness and viewed prisoners, whether their own captured soldiers or enemy POWs, with contempt. The Imperial Japanese Army's treatment of Allied prisoners of war was notoriously brutal, characterized by forced labor, starvation rations, physical abuse, and medical neglect. The infamous Burma Railway, Bataan Death March, and countless other atrocities demonstrated a systematic disregard for the welfare of captured enemy soldiers. Japanese military doctrine held that soldiers who surrendered had forfeited their humanity and deserved no consideration. This attitude extended to their own soldiers as well. Japanese troops who were captured and later repatriated after the war often faced social ostracism and were sometimes denied veterans' benefits. Given this background, Japanese POWs initially struggled to understand why their American captors would invest resources in their welfare. Some suspected ulterior motives, believing that the good treatment was designed to extract intelligence or cooperation. Others thought it might be temporary, a facade that would be dropped once they were no longer useful. However, as weeks turned into months and the standards remained consistent, many prisoners underwent a profound shift in their understanding.
They began to realize that the hygiene standards and overall treatment they received were not exceptional circumstances, but rather the normal baseline of how the American military operated. This realization challenged deeply held beliefs about American culture, military values, and the nature of their enemies.
The shower experience, in particular, became a powerful symbol of this cultural awakening. The simple act of standing under hot running water, using quality soap, and drying off with a clean towel represented a level of human dignity that their own military had denied them. It demonstrated that their captors viewed them as human beings worthy of basic care and comfort, not as contemptible objects to be exploited or discarded. For many Japanese POWs, this treatment was more humane than what they had experienced while serving in their own army. Some prisoners later reflected that they received better medical care, food, and living conditions as POWs than they ever had as soldiers of the emperor. The facilities themselves told a story of American industrial and organizational capacity. The ability to construct and operate POW camps with modern plumbing, reliable water heating systems, laundry facilities, and sanitation infrastructure demonstrated a level of resource abundance that Japan could not match. Even in facilities rapidly constructed to house the growing number of prisoners, American engineers ensured that basic amenities were included. Hot water heaters were installed, sewage systems were properly designed, and maintenance crews kept everything functioning. This attention to infrastructure, even for prisoners, illustrated the vast economic and industrial gulf between the two nations, a gap that ultimately doomed Japan's war effort, but that became personally meaningful to individual POWs through everyday experiences like taking a hot shower. Interviews and memoirs from Japanese POWs revealed the lasting impact of these experiences. Many expressed astonishment not just at the facilities themselves, but at the casualness with which American soldiers regarded them. To American guards and administrators, hot showers and clean facilities were simply standard operating procedure, nothing special or noteworthy. They couldn't understand why the prisoners were so amazed by basic hygiene amenities that they themselves took for granted. This cultural disconnect highlighted how profoundly different the two societies were in their expectations of basic living standards and treatment of individuals, even those classified as enemies. The educational component of hygiene in American POW camps also made an impression. Guards and camp administrators sometimes provided instruction in proper hygiene practices, demonstrating how to brush teeth correctly, explaining the importance of regular bathing, and encouraging prisoners to maintain clean living spaces. This educational approach reflected American public health initiatives that had dramatically reduced disease rates in civilian and military populations. For Japanese POWs who had never received such instruction, it represented another dimension of care that exceeded their expectations. Some prisoners adopted these practices enthusiastically, recognizing their value in preventing illness and improving quality of life. They carried this knowledge with them when they were eventually repatriated to Japan after the war.
The impact of these experiences extended beyond the individual prisoners to influence post-war Japanese society in subtle ways. Returning POWs, despite the stigma they faced, brought back first-hand accounts of American living standards and values. In a nation devastated by war, facing years of occupation and reconstruction, these accounts contributed to a broader understanding of the material and cultural factors that had enabled American victory. The hygiene standards that had so impressed Japanese POWs were part of a larger package of American modernity that Japan would study and, in many respects, seek to emulate during its remarkable post-war recovery. Modern sanitation, public health infrastructure, and attention to basic quality of life issues became priorities as Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes of defeat. The story of Japanese POWs and their reaction to American hygiene standards offers a unique window into the human dimension of World War II. It reminds us that war is not only about strategy, tactics, and battles, but also about the everyday experiences of individuals caught up in global conflict. The profound cultural differences between Imperial Japan and the United States manifested not just in military doctrine or political ideology, but in assumptions about basic human dignity and proper treatment of individuals. A hot shower, which seems like such a simple thing, carried complex meanings about resource allocation, cultural values, organizational priorities, and competing visions of what soldiers and human beings deserved. These experiences also highlight the transformative potential of humane treatment. Many Japanese POWs entered American captivity as dedicated soldiers who believed in their nation's cause and accepted the propaganda they had been taught about American brutality. The reality they encountered, hot showers, clean towels, medical care, and basic human dignity, challenged these beliefs and sometimes led to profound reassessments of the war and their own nation's conduct. Some became cooperative prisoners who assisted American intelligence efforts. Others simply tried to make sense of the contradiction between what they had been told and what they experienced. Very few emerged from captivity with their worldview entirely unchanged. The maintenance of high hygiene standards in POW camps was not merely humanitarian or pragmatic, it was also a form of cultural assertion. The United States demonstrated through its treatment of prisoners that it could afford to maintain these standards even for enemy combatants, that its values extended even to those who had fought against it, and that its organizational and material capabilities were sufficient to care for both its own people and its captured enemies simultaneously. This sent a powerful message about American strength and values, one that resonated far beyond the confines of the POW camps themselves. Japanese prisoners saw firsthand the industrial abundance and organizational efficiency that made the American war effort possible, embodied in something as simple as reliable hot water for showers.
For historians studying World War II, the reactions of Japanese POWs to American hygiene standards provide valuable insights into comparative military cultures, logistical capabilities, and the human experience of war. These accounts complement traditional military history focused on battles and strategy by illuminating the everyday realities that shaped soldiers' lives and perceptions. They reveal how material conditions and cultural assumptions intersected to create profoundly different experiences for soldiers on opposite sides of the conflict. The Japanese soldier, who had lived for months in a jungle foxhole, drinking contaminated water and suffering from multiple untreated ailments, inhabited a radically different physical and psychological world than the American soldier, who expected regular hot meals, medical care, and opportunities to maintain basic hygiene. The contrast also raises important questions about military effectiveness and the relationship between troop welfare and combat performance. The Imperial Japanese Army's neglect of basic hygiene and medical care, while driven partly by genuine resource constraints, also reflected ideological commitments to toughness and suffering as virtues. This approach undoubtedly contributed to the extraordinarily high disease casualty rates suffered by Japanese forces throughout the Pacific War. In many campaigns, Japanese units lost more soldiers to disease than to combat. While American forces also suffered from tropical diseases, particularly in the early stages of the war, aggressive public health measures, better supply lines, and cultural acceptance of medical care as essential kept disease rates significantly lower. The hot showers and hygiene standards maintained in POW camps were consistent with a broader American military culture that viewed healthy soldiers as more effective soldiers. The psychological impact of discovering that the enemy was more humane than one's own army cannot be overstated. For Japanese POWs who had been taught to revere the emperor and the Japanese military as the highest expressions of virtue and strength, the realization that they had been lied to about American brutality and that American standards of basic care exceeded those of their own military created profound cognitive dissonance. Some resolved this by deciding that they had been serving an unworthy cause.
Others compartmentalize the experience, maintaining loyalty to Japan while acknowledging the superior material conditions in American captivity. Still others suffered psychological crises as fundamental beliefs crumbled under the weight of contradictory evidence. The hot shower became a symbol of this larger confrontation with uncomfortable truths. As the war drew to a close and surrender became inevitable for Japan, the network of American POW camps housed thousands of Japanese prisoners who had experienced this cultural revelation. When they were eventually repatriated to a devastated homeland, they carried these memories with them. Many found it difficult to discuss their experiences in a society that still viewed surrender as shameful. Yet their first-hand knowledge of American society and values, gained through the seemingly mundane experience of daily life as a POW, contributed to post-war understanding and eventually to the reconciliation between former enemies. The Japanese POW who remembered his first hot shower in American captivity might later reflect on it as his first encounter with a different way of organizing society and valuing human welfare.
In the broader context of World War II history, the story of Japanese POWs and American hygiene standards might seem like a footnote compared to major battles and strategic decisions. Yet it reveals essential truths about the conflict and the societies that fought it. The Pacific War was not simply a clash of military forces, but a confrontation between fundamentally different social systems, cultural values, and assumptions about proper treatment of human beings. These differences manifested in countless ways, from grand strategy to the daily experience of individual soldiers. The hot shower that astonished a Japanese POW represented the same industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and cultural priorities that built fleets of ships, developed atomic weapons, and ultimately secured Allied victory. The legacy of these experiences continues to resonate in subtle ways. When examining the remarkably peaceful and constructive nature of the post-war American occupation of Japan and the subsequent alliance between the two nations, it's worth remembering that thousands of Japanese had already experienced American society and values through their captivity. While POW status was officially shameful and many returning prisoners struggled with stigma, their first-hand knowledge that Americans were not the demons depicted in wartime propaganda helped create a foundation for post-war understanding. The former POW, who had been treated with basic human dignity, who had received medical care and experienced hot showers and clean living conditions, might be more receptive to cooperation with occupation authorities and more willing to consider that American influence might not be entirely negative. This narrative also serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards even in wartime, not merely as a moral imperative, but as a practical matter with long-term consequences. The American decision to treat Japanese POWs according to established standards for hygiene, medical care, and basic welfare, despite the brutal treatment Allied prisoners received from Japanese forces, and despite the intense racism and hatred that characterized much of the Pacific War, represented a commitment to principle over revenge. This approach had tangible benefits, encouraging surrender by demonstrating that captivity need not mean torture or death, facilitating intelligence gathering from cooperative prisoners, and building goodwill that would prove valuable in the post-war period. The hot shower was part of a larger system of humane treatment that served both moral and strategic purposes. For the individual Japanese soldiers who experienced these American POW camps, the memory of those first hot showers remained vivid decades later. In interviews conducted by historians in subsequent years, elderly veterans would recall with remarkable clarity the sensation of hot water, the luxury of real soap, the comfort of a clean towel. These sensory memories had been seared into their consciousness because they represented such a stark departure from everything they had known.
The contrast between the deprivation of Imperial Army service and the relative comfort of American captivity had been so extreme that it challenged their understanding of their own nation and the enemy they had been taught to hate. A simple shower had become a profound life experience, a moment of revelation that reshaped their worldview.
In conclusion, the story of Japanese POWs and their astonishment at American hygiene standards reveals dimensions of World War II that are often overlooked in traditional military histories. It illustrates how cultural assumptions, material resources, organizational capabilities, and values manifested in the everyday experiences of individuals caught up in global conflict. The hot showers, soap, clean towels, and medical care that seemed miraculous to Japanese prisoners were mundane realities that Americans took for granted, yet they represented fundamental differences between the two societies. These differences extended far beyond military technology or economic output to encompass basic assumptions about human dignity and proper treatment of individuals, even enemies. For the Japanese POWs who experienced this cultural collision firsthand, a hot shower was never again just a hot shower. It remained throughout their lives a symbol of the day their world changed, when the propaganda dissolved in streams of hot water and they confronted the uncomfortable truth that their captors possessed not just superior firepower, but superior humanity. The documentation of Japanese POW experiences continued to emerge in the decades following the war as historians gained access to previously classified military records and as former prisoners, now elderly, felt more comfortable sharing their stories. These accounts consistently emphasized the shock of encountering American hygiene standards, suggesting that this was not merely an incidental detail, but a central element of their captivity experience. Researchers discovered that camp commanders had filed regular reports detailing the health improvements observed in Japanese prisoners after weeks or months of proper nutrition, medical care, and sanitary living conditions. Weight gain, recovery from diseases, healing of wounds, and elimination of parasitic infections were systematically documented, creating a medical record that starkly illustrated the deprivations these men had endured while serving their own military. The administrative records from American POW camps revealed the extensive infrastructure required to maintain these hygiene standards. Each facility employed teams of engineers responsible for maintaining water heating systems, plumbing, and sewage treatment facilities. Laundry operations required significant manpower and equipment, with industrial washing machines and dryers processing thousands of pounds of linens and clothing daily. Supply chains ensured continuous availability of soap, disinfectants, and cleaning supplies. Medical personnel conducted regular inspections not just of prisoners, but of facilities themselves, checking water quality, verifying proper waste disposal, and ensuring that sanitation standards met military specifications. This organizational machinery operated largely invisibly to the prisoners themselves, who simply experienced the results: hot water always available, clean towels regularly distributed, facilities maintained in working order. The cost of maintaining these standards was substantial but considered worthwhile by American military authorities. Budget documents from the War Department show significant expenditures on POW camp operations, including line items for soap, laundry equipment, plumbing repairs, and medical supplies. Critics occasionally questioned whether enemy prisoners deserved such treatment, particularly given reports of Japanese atrocities against Allied POWs. However, military leadership consistently defended the policy on both principled and practical grounds. Maintaining high standards prevented disease outbreaks that could spread beyond the camps, ensured compliance with international law, encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, and demonstrated American values to the world. The hot showers were part of a calculated strategy as well as a humanitarian commitment.
Individual stories from Japanese POWs add human dimension to these administrative details. One former soldier recalled arriving at a camp in California in late 1944, emaciated from months of malnutrition and covered in infected sores from jungle rot. He expected to be shot or at minimum beaten and put to hard labor with minimal food.
Instead, he was taken directly to a medical facility where doctors examined him, treated his infections with sulfa drugs and penicillin, medicines he had never heard of, and admitted him to a hospital ward where he spent 2 weeks recovering. When he was finally deemed healthy enough to join the general prisoner population, his introduction to the camp included a mandatory shower. He stood under the hot water and wept, overwhelmed by the realization that he was being treated better as a prisoner than he had ever been treated as a soldier of the emperor. Another account comes from a former sergeant who had served in the Philippines and survived the brutal fighting on Luzon before his capture in early 1945. He described the almost religious significance that the shower experience took on for him and his fellow prisoners. Men who had been taught that capture meant dishonor and death instead found themselves in an environment that treated them as human beings worthy of basic dignity. The daily opportunity to shower became a ritual of renewal, a time when they could wash away not just physical dirt, but also the accumulated psychological weight of propaganda, fear, and misplaced shame. Some prisoners initially refused to believe the good treatment would continue and hoarded soap, preparing for the day when supplies would be cut off. It took months for them to accept that the hygiene standards were permanent and reliable. The cultural aspects of bathing also created interesting interactions between American guards and Japanese prisoners. In Japanese culture, communal bathing in hot water, the tradition of public baths or onsen, was an important social practice with its own etiquette and significance. However, this tradition involved soaking in hot water rather than standing under running water and lathering with soap. Some prisoners initially didn't understand the purpose of the showers and tried to fill containers with hot water to create makeshift baths. Guards had to demonstrate proper shower technique, showing prisoners how to wet themselves, apply soap, scrub, and rinse. These mundane interactions became moments of cultural exchange, breaking down barriers between captors and captives through the shared human need for cleanliness. Language barriers complicated these exchanges, but also led to creative solutions. Many camps eventually trained Japanese-speaking interpreters, sometimes recruiting from the prisoner population itself, to help communicate camp rules and procedures. Printed instructions in Japanese were posted in shower facilities, explaining proper usage and encouraging daily bathing. Some camps even produced educational materials about hygiene, disease prevention, and sanitation, part of a broader effort to improve prisoner health and cooperation. These materials were remarkable not just for their practical content, but for what they revealed about American assumptions: that prisoners were capable of learning and changing, that education was worthwhile even for enemy combatants, and that knowledge about hygiene was valuable enough to justify the effort of translation and instruction.
The contrast in attitudes toward personal cleanliness between Japanese military culture and American POW camp standards extended to clothing as well. In the Imperial Japanese Army, soldiers often wore the same uniform continuously for weeks or months, with no opportunity for washing or replacement. Clothing deteriorated from constant wear, tropical conditions, and lack of maintenance, until it literally fell apart. Soldiers might have only one uniform, wearing it day and night, sleeping in the same clothes they wore for combat. When these items finally wore out, replacements came irregularly, if at all. Japanese POWs arriving in American camps often wore uniforms that were tattered, filthy, and barely recognizable as military clothing. American POW camps provided prisoners with clean clothing on a regular schedule. Typically, prisoners received simple work uniforms made of durable fabric marked with PW or similar identification. These garments were collected, laundered, and redistributed on a weekly basis, or more frequently if needed. For men who had worn the same filthy uniform for months, the experience of putting on clean, freshly laundered clothing was almost as remarkable as the hot showers themselves. The psychological impact of wearing clean clothes, sleeping in clean bedding, and maintaining a clean living space contributed to improved morale and mental health among the prisoner population. Many later reflected that feeling clean allowed them to feel human again after months or years of degradation. The medical benefits of improved hygiene were dramatic and well documented. Camp physicians noted that new arrivals typically suffered from a constellation of ailments directly related to poor sanitation: skin infections, parasitic infestations, dysentery, dental problems, and general debilitation from malnutrition and disease. After several weeks of regular bathing, clean clothing, delousing treatments, medical care, and adequate nutrition, these conditions typically resolved. Weight gain was substantial, often 20 or 30 pounds within the first few months of captivity. Skin cleared as infections healed. Parasites were eliminated through treatment and prevented from recurring through good hygiene. Dental work addressed years of neglect. The transformation was so remarkable that some prisoners became nearly unrecognizable compared to photographs taken at the time of their capture. These health improvements had practical benefits for camp administration. Healthy prisoners were easier to manage, less prone to unrest, and capable of performing work assignments if required. Disease outbreaks, which could have spread from prisoner populations to guards and surrounding communities, were prevented through vigilant hygiene standards. The medical staff could focus on treatment rather than constantly battling preventable diseases caused by poor sanitation. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, maintaining high hygiene standards made operational sense regardless of any humanitarian considerations. However, the consistent application of these standards, even when prisoners were uncooperative or when resources were strained, suggests that principle, not just pragmatism, motivated American policy.
The psychological dimension of hygiene deserves particular attention. Modern psychology recognizes the connection between physical cleanliness and mental health, but this understanding was less developed in the 1940s. Nevertheless, American camp administrators observed that improved hygiene seemed to improve prisoner morale and behavior. Men who could maintain basic cleanliness, who wore clean clothes and lived in sanitary conditions, displayed better mental health than might be expected given the trauma of combat and captivity. Some camp commanders explicitly noted this connection in their reports, observing that the opportunity to maintain personal hygiene gave prisoners a sense of control and dignity that reduced despair and improved cooperation. For Japanese prisoners, this psychological benefit was particularly significant because it challenged the narrative of shame that surrounded their captivity. Imperial propaganda held that captured soldiers had disgraced themselves and their families, that they were no longer truly Japanese, and that they deserved contempt and suffering. Yet the daily experience of being treated with basic human dignity contradicted this narrative. The guard who ensured hot water was available, the medical officer who treated their ailments, the laundry worker who provided clean towels. These Americans seemed not to view them with contempt, but with something closer to professional detachment, or even, occasionally, sympathy. This treatment suggested that perhaps surrender was not the ultimate disgrace, that perhaps the propaganda had been lies, and that perhaps there were alternative ways of understanding honor and human worth. This psychological recalibration was not universal or immediate. Many prisoners struggled with conflicting emotions, loyal to their nation and emperor, yet unable to deny the evidence of their own experience. Some resolved this tension by distinguishing between the Japanese nation and people, whom they still loved, and the military leadership whose incompetence and cruelty they increasingly questioned. Others underwent more radical transformations, becoming willing to cooperate with American authorities, provide intelligence, and even assist in propaganda efforts directed at Japanese forces still fighting. These so-called cooperative prisoners were controversial among their fellow POWs and would face severe social consequences after repatriation. But their cooperation was often motivated by genuine conviction that the war was wrong and that American treatment demonstrated superior values. The physical layout and design of shower facilities in American POW camps reflected both practical considerations and underlying assumptions about privacy and dignity. Unlike the communal bathing traditions of Japan or the often crude and exposed bathing arrangements of military field conditions, American shower facilities typically provided some degree of privacy and individual space. While not private by civilian standards, showers were generally in open rooms with multiple shower heads, they were designed with human dignity in mind. Adequate space between shower stations, proper drainage to prevent standing water, good ventilation to prevent mold and mildew, and sufficient lighting created an environment that was functional and reasonably comfortable.
Some camps experimented with different approaches to bathing schedules and procedures. Early in the war, when Japanese prisoners were relatively rare, individual camps developed their own procedures. As the prisoner population grew, standardization became necessary for efficiency and fairness. Most camps settled on daily access to showers, either with assigned time slots for different prisoner groups or with open hours when facilities were available. This generous access reflected American abundance and stood in stark contrast to the water rationing that characterized Japanese military operations. Prisoners who had previously gone weeks without bathing could now shower daily if they wished, a luxury that seemed almost incomprehensible. The maintenance of these facilities required constant attention and significant resources. Hot water heaters, typically large boilers fired by coal or oil, consumed substantial fuel. Plumbing systems needed regular inspection and repair to prevent leaks and maintain water pressure. Drainage systems required cleaning to prevent clogs and backups. The chemicals used for water treatment and facility sanitation had to be properly stored and applied. The personnel responsible for these tasks were often overlooked in the operation of POW camps, yet their work was essential to maintaining the hygiene standards that so impressed Japanese prisoners. A maintenance worker ensuring the boiler operated properly was indirectly serving a strategic purpose by maintaining American credibility and demonstrating national capabilities. As the war progressed and the number of Japanese POWs increased, particularly after the fall of Okinawa and as surrender became imminent, the challenge of maintaining hygiene standards across a growing camp system became more complex. New facilities had to be constructed quickly, often in remote locations. Engineers worked to replicate the infrastructure that had proven successful in established camps, ensuring that even hastily built facilities included proper sanitation. The consistency of these standards across different camps and over time demonstrated organizational competence and commitment to policy that impressed not just prisoners, but also international observers monitoring POW treatment. The Red Cross, when granted access to inspect American POW camps holding Japanese prisoners, consistently found that hygiene and sanitation standards met or exceeded international requirements. The experience of Japanese POWs with American hygiene standards also had an educational dimension that extended beyond personal cleanliness. Many prisoners had limited education and came from rural backgrounds where modern sanitation was unknown. Their time in American camps exposed them to concepts of public health, disease prevention, and the connection between sanitation and health outcomes. Some prisoners became genuinely interested in these topics, asking questions of medical personnel and seeking to understand the science behind the practices they observed. This curiosity represented a form of intellectual engagement that camp administrators generally encouraged, viewing it as both humanitarian and potentially useful for post-war reconstruction.
The water itself deserves consideration as a resource and symbol. Access to abundant, clean water was foundational to the hygiene standards that characterized American POW camps. The United States, with its extensive water infrastructure and generally adequate water resources, could afford to use water generously for sanitation purposes. This water abundance contrasted sharply with conditions in the Pacific Theater, where water was often scarce, contaminated, or difficult to transport. Japanese forces had struggled constantly with water supply issues, forced to use whatever sources were available regardless of quality. The ability of American camps to provide unlimited clean hot water for showering represented not just material abundance, but successful engineering, infrastructure development, and resource management at a national scale. The soap provided to Japanese POWs warrants additional discussion as well. American military soap of the era was functional rather than luxurious, designed to clean effectively in various water conditions and climates. Nevertheless, To men who had rarely had access to any soap at all, these plain bars were remarkable. Some prisoners reported that the soap smelled good, a small pleasure that seemed almost frivolous given their circumstances, but that contributed to the overall sense that they were being treated as human beings rather than animals or objects. The scent of clean soap, the feel of lather, the sensation of rinsing away dirt and grime, these sensory experiences created positive associations that contrasted dramatically with the harsh deprivation of their previous existence. The distribution and replenishment of soap and other hygiene supplies followed organized procedures that reflected American logistical capabilities. Supplies were issued on regular schedules, with new items provided as old ones were depleted. Inventory was tracked, requisitions were processed, and supply chains ensured continuous availability. This mundane administrative machinery, operating reliably in the background, was itself a demonstration of organizational competence that Japanese prisoners noted and sometimes admired. Their own military had been plagued by supply failures, leaving troops without essential items even when those items theoretically existed in depots elsewhere. The contrast between Japanese logistical dysfunction and American efficiency was evident even in something as simple as ensuring every prisoner had soap.